What is up, Eternal Team? Welcome to another EPL Eternal Logos podcast. Finally back, just like we promised. I think we're officially finally ready to get things going, get some content out to you guys. It's May, it's Mother's Day, May 14th. Let me check my date there. Yes, it is May 14th, Mother's Day, and really excited to finally have everything in place. The last time you guys saw an episode, we were right here recording. It was a very short episode, but it was just an introduction to the new studio. So I'm really happy to get back to you guys. You saw everything and kind of where it was. Officially, the audio is audioed. Thanks to my boy Adam Greenlee. As I promised, he said he was going to be coming, and he did. We spent a couple of hours getting all the audio and all the mics set up in all of their stations. So everything is ready to go. It's just pretty much at this point just getting out content to everybody. Like I said before, there'll be some things coming that we'll put around in the room and for some decorations. You see my lion here. That's for, because I'm a lion, I have a lion's mane. But that stuff will be coming as we go. But more or less, we're ready to record more episodes and get people in the studio, get me in here sharing some ideas like I was doing before. Today, this is another sort of monologue that I'm doing just to make sure that things are set up and the audio is working. And so this is going to partly be an episode where I do have some content prepared for everybody, so don't worry about that. But also, before I officially get someone into the studio, which I'm hoping by the end of the month, shout out to my girl Jenna. We've talked about having an episode, so she's going to be on soon. Hopefully we can set that up pretty soon within, like I said, maybe by the end of the month, maybe by sometime next month. And then I have been talking to family members and friends, and people are excited to come on. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next month or so. And so, like I said, we're back. I'm excited. Finally back to you guys getting in front of the camera. I have a lot of things going on behind the scenes. I actually have to do all of the video recording and stuff myself. I also am starting to do some music production. That was a promise that I made to myself that I would get that going. And so that'll actually, some of the music that I'm going to produce is going to actually be for the podcast. Maybe I'll do an opening jingle, an outro, something like that. But that's all exciting stuff that's working in the background. Like always, I'd just like to give you guys a quick update of where we are so you guys can obviously follow along with the journey with the podcast and how it's growing. But like I said, this is a content episode, so let's get at you with the content. Oh, one thing before we do that, I actually want to see if this works. So like you guys are on me with me on the journey. Tongue twist. I'm looking at this camera here, so I'm going to try to bounce back between cameras. I hit my mic there. But I do have cameras set up, additional cameras. There's one here right in front of me, and then there's one over here. You can probably see that one in this camera, but I'm going to try to work the cameras a bit to kind of see what that's like when I do the video recording, and you guys can see it in live action. And if anybody has any questions to figure out how you do that, I hopefully will have at that point enough experience recording this episode and other episodes in the future to kind of give people as much coaching as I possibly can for the future. So thank you, everybody, again. Welcome to another episode. Here we go. There's a lot of talk, and I thought this would be a good episode to do for Mother's Day because I think mothers more or less exemplify this topic. It's a massive topic going around in the podcasting world. I know a lot of people are involved in the discussion, and rightfully so, but it's the topic of relationships. I think more or less in these other podcasts that are taking place on YouTube and everywhere. I know there's Rumble now that I hear is a way of sharing content. Some people stream on Twitch. There's just a big conversation going on in social circles, personal and on the internet, about relationships. And it's normally romantic relationships that I think people are talking about. I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about relationships on Mother's Day because I think mothers are the first people that we experience in our lives when we're born that really give us a sense of intimacy and nurturing in our lives. And so they say mothers pass down the culture to children. And so I thought talking about relationships, romantically and otherwise, would be a good way to kick off. I don't know if we're going to call this a season of the Eternal Logos podcast, but I thought it would be really cool to talk about relationships and some of my thoughts on the conversation that's happening out there on YouTube. And so what I think we're going to start off with is, like we always do, right? What do we mean when we say relationships, right? What are we talking about exactly? And my definition of relationships, and I think a definition that might more or less fill the definition for most people out there, is when you build a connection or chemistry with a person. This can be in terms of a friendship. This can be romantic relationships. This can be marriage, short-term, long-term. There's a lot of different words that are going on out there that are in the air, in the social and in our culture, that describe different relationships that people are experiencing today. There's a lot of different sexuality terms. There are differences in how people identify with relationships. But relationships go further than obviously just romantic relationships. There's acquaintances, there's relationships that we have at our jobs, there's friends and all kinds of things, family, obviously. And I just think, just to get a full context with relationships, is to understand fully what relationship is. And not that I'm going to necessarily go into a psychological definition of what relationship is, because I'm not qualified necessarily to talk about, what the psychological impacts of relationships are, even though obviously I'll be giving my opinion on some of that stuff. But as far as a technical definition and what that might mean, can vary a bit, and so can have some technicalities behind it. And I'd love to get more information and learn a little bit more about what relationships and what they are to us psychologically, etc. are. But I thought today, talking about relationships and romantic relationships, since it's such a big topic, and this is something that we will obviously have a discussion on in different later podcasts when other people are on the podcast. I know Jenna, we're going to talk about relationships when she's on the podcast. And so with that definition, when you have a certain chemistry or a connection that you built with someone, with another person, and exactly what that means. And I think what's happening in the podcasting world right now and in our culture when it comes to relationships and discussing relationships, we're talking about what does it mean when you're in a short-term relationship, a long-term relationship, what makes a successful one, what it means when relationships break down, and how do you deal with them? And more importantly, how we move forward and what is the best method of approaching relationships, right? Because I think ultimately where relationships are and how they form and how they manifest into our futures really has a massive impact on our culture and in our society. A lot of people hold the view that relationships that ultimately lead from dating to what we would call quote unquote a romantic relationship and then ultimately marriage is what is the core value or the sustaining force for building strong communities, i.e. when you get married, you have a family, and from a family, you're able to better contribute to the community by passing down, obviously, values and such, and also, growing up in a community that encourages that, where values are similar, et cetera, and which ultimately affects our nation and ultimately affects our world. So I think there are a lot of different angles that people take when talking about relationships, because I think people mostly believe that relationship is the foundation of how we interact with one another on a daily basis. And that ultimately has a great impact on how we move forward and how we progress into our future. And ultimately our children and our grandchildren, our children's children. But it's really important to have that conversation. And so with that definition, like I said, it's a very loose definition. And I'd love when I have guests on, we'll define those terms as we always do here on the EPO, Eternal Logos podcast. We try to make sure we are understanding the definitions and things when what we're talking about. We're also making sure that we know contextually what it is we're hoping to get from this. And so got a couple of notes here. So I wanted to ask a question to all the listeners and see what people thought about this. But the question to start really is, what do you want in a relationship, or what do you want out of a relationship? And I think you can kind of phrase it in a number of different ways, but I think people understand in essence what I'm saying, right? When you're in a relationship, when you are going to either date someone or you are becoming official, or you're entering into a marriage. Let me take a step back. I think ultimately what people want from relationships, or at least taking a step back, what we feel on our inside intrinsically is companionship. And I think that's a value that people have biologically and psychologically, is companionship. Right. I find that no matter who I talk to, no matter what walk of life or what culture, everybody has a desire, an internal desire that seems to be built into us fundamentally, biologically, psychologically, for companionship. And that's really important. Obviously, human beings are social creatures, but specifically companionship with another human being. Right. And I think that we'll get into the thick of exactly what that means. If it's one person, how many people, right? But I think ultimately, even in relationships where there may be multiple people involved, I think I always hear from people who I know who live that lifestyle, they still want at least one person to love, right? And I think that can vary depending upon men and women. There's a variable in the relationship discussion, but back to the question, what do we want out of relationships? I think whenever I get into these discussions with people, I always try to get a sense for who they are and what they want and what they say they want. I probably won't get super detailed because I would like to save a lot of that discussion and a lot of those key points in the discussion with Jenna and other people in the future, because I'm sure that this will be a topic that comes up, as it always is a topic. Every single day I feel like I'm engaging with this topic. But I like to ask people, what do you want in a relationship, out of a relationship? Ultimately, what's your goal, right? You guys know how I am at this point on the EPL, Eternal Logos podcast. I try to hold people accountable on a number of different areas, on another number of different categories. I think there is what I individually expect from people. There is what society expects from us. And then there's what you expect from yourself. And I think it's really important to get people's idea of what they think or what they feel or what they want out of a relationship. And I mean really want out of a relationship, right? There's a lot of people that might in a moment tell you what they're looking for in a date at the dating capacity. But I like to ask, if you're 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, what do you want? Like, what do you really want? Y'all know in this podcast, I don't do this surface stuff. There's obviously surface things that we discuss on a daily basis, but if we're really going to make some progress, we really got to think about, what do you want? Like, really, ultimately, what's your goal? Where do you want to be in 5 to 10 years? I'm going to go off on a little bit of a rant here. I have conversations with people all the time about various different topics, not just relationships, so side quest. And I find that we tend to play this game when we're asked these kinds of questions. I find that people, especially in their youth, spend a lot of time thinking about what they will ultimately try to do when they get to the later years in their life. So say a 20-year-old, 21-year-old, 22-year-old is thinking about getting married. Like, I want to get married someday, connecting it back to relationships. And they'll say, I have time to do that. I have time to get married. I have time to think about it. I have time to settle down. I have time to have kids. First off, tomorrow's not promised. Cliche quote there. It's not, obviously. But I've always found, specifically in my life, and as I've moved into my 30s, that it's important always to consider your future. And it's more important to consider your future when you're young, because that's the best time to start investing in your future. If you're hip to investing, you don't want to start investing in your future or your retirement fund when you are age 35, right? You want to start investing in your retirement fund as soon as you start working, as soon as you start in your career. Start learning the right habits of how to save and how to put money in the proper place, because you don't want to take these lessons that you can learn early and apply to them later, because you'll be behind, more or less, right? And so I find this to be true in everything that we do in our lives. I think when you're young, investing in yourself is very important, and that goes further, obviously, than just money. A lot of people look at and say investing in your career and what you're going to be. There's a contentious point, or at least a point that is argued back and forth when it comes to relationships in the podcasting world, talking about what's important to women versus men and the fulfillment that we get in our day-to-day lives when it comes to our careers. But that is a form of investing in yourself. But I don't necessarily think that investing in your career has to be at the sacrifice of a relationship or the idea of having a long-term future or partner or partnership or husband or wife or however you define it. I'm not intentionally in this podcast trying to use language that's going to more or less give away or talk through what my personal beliefs are. I will touch on that for sure, but I'd like to try to save that for discussions and debates. But I think it's important to invest in your future. And the biggest investment you'll make in your future is who you're ultimately going to be with when you get later down the line in your life. And so I think it's important to, at the very least, when you're early on living in your 20s, even your your late teens, to really consider and think about what a long-term relationship is going to look like, what you want out of a long-term relationship ultimately, and start to do everything and invest in that today, right? Okay. So what do you want in a relationship? Ultimately, where do you want to be and how do you get there? And I think there are a lot of people who want long-term. Rarely do I hear people say that they want to be in short-term relationships for their entire life. You know what I mean? And I find that to be telling about us as human beings and what we ultimately desire, what we ultimately want. And so that's an important question. Feel free to comment on what you think about that and what your answer is, and let's engage in a bit of a discussion on that point. With that being said, some points of contention, the differences between men and women when it comes to relationships. There are a lot of podcasts that talk about these things, obviously, like I have mentioned like 80 times already. And so I think traditionally, at least the traditional argument is that obviously men and women are different. And I think the number one thing in relationships is, what are you getting out of it? What is the exchange between man and woman, person to person? I think there are a number of different communities today that are going to have to start to define that for them. Not exactly sure, sort of who or what or how that will ultimately land. But I think traditionally, man and woman, men get something from relationships, women get another thing from relationships. And I think that's just basically because of biology and psychology and evolution and how we're designed as human beings. And so the thing I think that is often discussed that is the point of contention is the differences and what those differences mean and what happens when those differences happen in reality, when it becomes pragmatic. I think conceptually, in an ideal world, we can very often think what would be the perfect scenario, but that oftentimes doesn't line up with reality. And I think that is where most of the discussion is taking place. And there are all kinds of questions asked about cheating. There's all kinds of questions asked about, women want this thing and men want this thing, and how come we can't seem to get it together? And there is a modernization of relationships and dating that's happening today. And I think it's causing a massive discussion, and also a divide to some degree, because I think, at least from what I understand in the history, is coming from a traditional mindset, moving from that to, the women's rights movements and sexual liberation and all of those things are impacting and having a profound impact on what we would call previously held traditional values. And now there's a modernization. And I think a lot of people are coining the term modern women, modern men, modern dating, modern society, and modern culture. And that is having a profound impact on dating. I'm not going to disclose my dating life at the moment, but I'm sure it will come up in later podcasts. But I want to make sure that people understand, just how the dating world is being impacted and affected. And I think that's the context that we have to move forward when we talk about these things, because it's not exactly easy to navigate, especially if you don't understand where these things obviously come from. And that's obviously what we do on the podcast. And so I'll say a couple of things in terms of what I have found to be true about dating, and then I'll get to another couple of points that I have noted. So dating as a man in 2023, and I anticipate that it's always to some degree been very difficult for men to date. I think there's a statistic that says only about 40% of men throughout human history have reproduced, right? And ultimately, dating, relationships, and marriage, historically, biologically, has been about reproduction. If you think about it from the evolutionary perspective, if you come from a religious background, you think about design and how we were created, regardless of what side of the aisle you stand on in that, I think it remains true that throughout all of human history, reproduction has been one of the major driving forces of human beings and in our society. And so dating as a man, at least if you take that statistic about the 40% of men reproducing, if that is true, and we have good reason to believe that that is true. I mean, let alone looking at how dating is today and how difficult it is. I'll get to a point that will make that maybe make a little bit more sense in a second. But it's difficult to date as a man. And I'm not talking about dating or simply just reproducing. I'm talking about just dating. Hey, I'm walking to a restaurant. I see an attractive young lady. I want to say hi. I want to get a connection. I want to continue to talk, to potentially pursue a relationship or a dating experience with the young lady. It's very difficult to do. There is obviously just the expectations on men that men are the ones that kind of initiate, more or less. We're the icebreakers in it all. A lot of men approach that in a lot of different ways, but more or less there is obviously the feeling of rejection. Men are rejected most of the time. That may be a shock to some of you, but men are rejected very often. Women are selective, and I do actually believe and hold the position that that's a good thing, that women have to obviously protect themselves. There are a lot of men out there who are predators, etc. And so it makes sense to me that women are selective. That leads to obviously men being rejected 80-90% of the time. And that is if you got what we consider good game, you have experience enough to be attractive to women, you look the part to be attractive to women, and some other things, right? And obviously I'm speaking from the man's perspective, and I can also lend some thoughts maybe now or in the future about my perspective from a woman's perspective, which actually maybe I'll do a little bit now. But more or less it's pretty difficult to date as a man, especially in 2023. The point I was making before is that this has become even more what a lot of statistics are supporting when it comes to dating apps and how often men swipe right versus how often women swipe right. And all this is just information and data to kind of get a sense for where people's mindsets and where people's psychology is today when it comes to dating and relationships. And so what you see, I think, is women and women empowerment and women with the sexual liberation movement dating all the way back to the 60s. Some people have said and gone as far back in history to look at that information, talking about the, birth control, the invention of birth control and what that has done. And so because women are selective, I think naturally, which makes sense again, the more freedom people have, I think generally speaking, I think particularly when it comes to dating and women, the more freedom you have, the more opportunity that you see for yourself ideally. And so I think when it comes to dating and relationships in 2023, especially with the advent of social media, that you get a lot of women and men. I think women probably experience it a lot sooner in life than men, because women are attractive to men, and men, as soon as women get to be 18 plus, they are pursued by men pretty consistently and constantly. I think any woman watching this podcast right now, just in the however long we've been talking, you've probably gotten a DM in your social media DMs from some guy who thinks you're attractive, right? Men don't experience that almost at all, if ever. And so I think with that, women have in some ways become even more selective. You can make the argument, because it's like, well, you can go out and now explore your options as a woman and see what's available to you, and then try to pick. And this is a word that's going around in the podcast world, in them saying that women are naturally hypergamous, which from what I understand is defined as always looking for a better option, more or less, right? Always looking for something better than, what you have or what you think might be available to you in this moment. And so I think everybody to some degree always wants more. We're always striving for more things. But I think particularly in relationships and dating, you see this happen. And again, it does make sense to a degree. And so that becomes really difficult for in a number of different ways. And so that ultimately impacts men and women. For men, I think with social media, we're consistently inundated with information as far as what pretty women are out there and available. You can travel across the world now. I always like to say, when having this conversation, I talk to people and I draw this analogy. I said, 500 years ago, right, before the invention of automobiles, cars, and planes and all of this stuff, your dating pool virtually was a couple mile radius, anywhere from 5 to 10 miles, maybe, if that, because you talk about how far you'd have to travel to meet other people and how accessible travel was to you. Maybe if you had some money and you could afford a wagon. I'm being kind of funny, but it's more or less what's available to you in terms of reach and how far you could go in a day or travel, right? If you went from Atlanta to living in Chicago, right? You would make the trip and you would live in Chicago. Now, it wasn't this back and forth thing because, again, there's no cars, no plane. And so your dating pool is limited to your reach and what you can have at your disposal. You know, you from 500 years, you move up the timeline a little bit, right? 100 years ago, that expands a little bit, maybe across cities, because you start to, cars are invented, and all of these things, and technology is becoming more accessible to people to a degree, and so your reach expands a little bit. You maybe city to city, maybe state to state. Today in 2023, our dating pool feels like it's global, right? There's passport bros out there now, right? And so that is, and I've heard a number of different psychologists and people who know psychological literature very well in saying that we have no idea the impact, really. Like, this is brand new. We don't really know the psychological impact that this is going to have on human beings and how we're going to respond, and ultimately what this means as far as where we're going to ultimately end up. And so that is interesting, and it's hard to fathom, really, and think into the future. And I think people are optimistic, but there are a lot of things that I think, and a lot of pitfalls that I think we're in danger of falling into when it comes to relationships and dating if we're not careful, and if we don't have the mindset of honoring, at the very least, again, without saying too much about how I feel in this particular episode, at the very least, honoring to some degree some traditional values, because I think we're starting to see a lot of the impacts in comparing where we were 50 years ago versus where we are now. And I think there is a lot of breakdown. I just got out of having a conversation. Shout out to my friend Kara, who has done this Real Talk event at her house where she's bringing people into her home, and we're having a discussion about various topics. In a conversation that we were having when at that last event, right, it's really changing things, and we don't, like I said, don't know exactly where things are going. We're optimistic some, but there are definitely some things that we're going to have to consider. There's going to be some things that we're going to have to reel in a little bit and just a ton of different things that I think are worthy of discussion, which is why we're here having this conversation, which is why the podcast's relationship dating world has exploded, because I think a lot of people are seeing the impact. At that event, one of the questions that I asked was, do we think that relationships are getting better? In other words, it was at the premise of it was vetting, right? Are we good at vetting one another? And by vetting, I mean when you are in the talking stage of getting to know a person, do you know what to look for? Do you know what good traits are? Are you aware of yourself if you're a woman versus a man? There are different things that we need, given the differences in sex. There are a lot of traumas that people experience when they're in their youth and they're growing up. And these are all questions, important questions that have to be answered and that one has to be aware of in order to make an informed decision when selecting someone to date, get into a relationship, and or marry them ultimately. And my answer was no. That is definitely an opinion that I have. I think that we are worse than we used to be with vetting. And I think, one of the interesting points that someone brought up in that discussion was, if someone was married or in a relationship back in the day, they would probably have a lot of the same issues. My counterpoint was that, but they stayed together for the purpose of marriage, which was for the family, right? And so while you could say their feelings might have been hurt or they might not have been happy necessarily in a relationship, I'm sure it's not always all bad and it's not always all good, obviously, but there was a duty. Marriage is centered around duty in many ways and in many cultures, and in Eastern cultures, we can even see today, right? And I think there is a core value in that I think is true. Now, if you're one of those people that wants to move away from those traditional core values, then so be it. But there are impacts, and there are definitely some consequences. And that was one thing that came up also in that discussion. It was, you can ultimately as a person make your decisions and choose what you want for yourself, but you don't get to choose the consequences. I will return to that thought and comment a number of times in the podcast, I guarantee you, because I think in our world in 2023, a lot of people are trying to control the consequences. And we can get into that, like I said, a little bit later for sure. But that was a lot to chew on there. Let me move on to my next point here, but hopefully you guys are following me in a bit in terms of what I mean when I say those things. I think when you do get into a relationship, regardless of if you want ultimately a marriage legally, some people are like, I don't want a legal marriage. I don't want the state to be involved. Whatever the case is, if you're in a relationship and you're not married, you just want a long-term husband or wife. Some people are calling them partners. Whatever the case is, I think ultimately one has to ask themselves, and again, back to our Eternal Logos style, right? What do you want? How do you define it? Are you aware of yourself? And does the conclusion, whatever it is that you say you want, does that line up with your values, right? Say you're in a relationship or you're married and you think that, let's just say you're in a traditional marriage and divorce is traditionally not on the table, more or less, apart from abuse and some other things. But more or less, I think the idea behind marriage traditionally is that you're together and you stay together. What happens when your partner does something you don't like? That's not tantamount or equivalent to, say, like abuse, but what do you do? How do you respond to that? If you do have a traditional mindset on divorce is off the table, apart from the things that I mentioned, if they do something and you're just not happy that day, do you call off the marriage? Do you go get a divorce? Right? And what does that look like in your individual life? And what's the impact and the consequences of that decision when you make it, right? I want to address this point real fast, really quickly, about monogamy and non-monogamy, as those are two terms. I think there are a number of terms that people are going by today. But I think it's one of those things I think that is becoming more of a topic and more happening in more discussions. And I think there is a natural way of being. And then I think there is the idea spiritually or otherwise of how one can transcend their nature. And I think, let me explain it a bit. I think a lot of people are making the argument that, naturally people are non-monogamous, right? And I think there is truth to that. Certainly for some people will argue, certainly for men, some people will argue for women less, right? Because women can get pregnant and, women form bonds through intimacy and sex that ultimately bonds them to the person. There is some bonding, obviously, hormonally that happens for men and women, but I think science has shown to some degree that women do this more physiologically. And, some people make the argument both, but either way, regardless of where you fall on the debate, I think it's something to be discussed, because I think it is, people are exploring it more nowadays, or at the very least far more open about it, which can lead to some pros and some cons, I think, when you're talking about non-monogamy specifically. And I think people are more open to it now, because I think what people are saying is like, well, people are going to do it anyway. People cheat, people go behind other people's, behind their significant others' backs all the time. So if you're going to do it, at least be open about it and discuss it, right? And I don't necessarily think that, in my opinion, this is definitely an opinion that I hold. I'm not a huge fan of consent morality. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying that consent's not important. Of course, consent is absolutely important. There always has to be consent in any actions that two people may take, especially when it comes to affecting one another. What I mean when I say consent morality. I don't think because someone consents that means that it's then therefore permissible or moral, right? Two different things. I don't think that, everyone should think that as long as I have a person that is okay with this, that it's okay to do. I could give examples of that all day. And I think just listening to this now, you could probably think about examples of that yourself, about where that is not appropriate. And if you don't think so, come on the podcast. We could talk about it. Like I said, always available for the smoke for anybody that might not agree. But again, it is my opinion. And I think I could back that up with evidence, in anecdotal evidence, as well as other forms of evidence that people might disagree on that point. But I think what that can lead to is a number of different issues in the world and in our society. Obviously, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination making the argument that monogamy solves all problems, obviously, because people do get into marriages and sometimes marriages can be a disaster. But the question is then raised, like, well, what kind of marriage did you have? Were you set up for success? Did you vet right in the first place? What are the reasons that you got married for, right? And so obviously there's some nuance and some variance there, but I think, at least in my opinion, it is something that is going to, ultimately, we're going to see an impact. We're going to see consequences in the next 5 to 10 years of, the actions that that are happening today, obviously, right? I think we've seen where traditional values can lead, because that's obviously been a long time in our history, and so has non-monogamy. Non-monogamy is obviously by not any stretch of the imagination new to human beings or society, and I think there's a lot of study on history about what happens in societies, when nuclear families break down, et cetera, et cetera. But like I said, that's definitely information I'm continuously researching, listening to other podcasts and seeing what other people have to say and the research they've done, and just comparing notes and all of these things. But ultimately, it is an interesting conversation. And I just wanted to bring that up to give everybody, put the idea in people's heads so that perhaps we can get a discussion going, and you guys will write some questions and comment, and when I have conversations, those are things that I can bring up in the future. So to end, I would like to sort of give my personal position on a few things. Well, not a few things, but one idea specifically, because I'm a believer. I always want to be authentic, as I've said in the past before. And I'm not just going to be here grilling people or debating people on their viewpoint. I also am going to put my viewpoint and my worldview on the table as well. I think that's the most honest way to do it. And so one of the viewpoints that I see, at least, is there is certainly, if nothing else, there's a visible breakdown or separation happening in our world today. There are a lot of different reasons. I think relationships in the general sense, not just romantic relationships, but relationships are breaking down in every single major category we can imagine in our world today and in our culture, specifically in the Western world. I know there's obviously problems in other parts of the world, but I guess this specific part is really contained more or less to the Western world, the most free society, the most free world we've ever seen in human history, one could argue, at least politically and under government. But there is definitely a separation happening. And as a believer, I think two things, and I think I want to end on this point because I think it really shows, again, what the Eternal Logos podcast is ultimately about, which is my core values, and does that align with conclusions that I draw in my personal life and moving forward, right? And so, two things with separation. There's good and then there's bad, right? In my opinion, I think the separation is good and bad. I think it's bad because of all the terrible things that are happening as a result. The breakdown of families, degenerate kids. I think, we're more divided on basically every topic you can imagine. We like to think it's getting better, but there, in a lot of ways, it seems to be getting worse. That's causing a lot of issues and all kinds of things. School shootings. There is, more children are born to single parent households. A lot of them obviously are women, single mothers. And it's just causing a lot of issues. There's obviously STDs and all kinds of things that are just happening. And that's truly the bad that I think anybody who's looking for a better world would obviously stand against and say something about. But what's the good as a non-believer? I'm sorry. A non-believer would have to answer that for themselves. Misspoke. As a believer, what's the good? What's the silver lining here? I think having something to say that might make sense and help people to realign with what I think is the truth. And the last thing would be that I think that this is absolutely straight from scripture. I can talk about that at a later date. So if you want to hear more about that, if you want to hear more about my viewpoint on that and what that exactly does that mean, tune in to later episodes. Thank you guys so much for coming to this podcast. Thank you for clicking the button. If you want to like and subscribe, please like and subscribe. If you want to comment, please comment. I actually prefer comments more than likes and subscriptions. Like I said, this podcast is designed and put together for discussions and really engaging ourselves and trying to learn how we can think better and how we can be better thinkers and how we can ultimately have that lead to better conclusions in our lives for our families and our community. So thank you guys so much. And look at this camera one more time because I think it's cool. And we'll see you guys next time. Thanks, Eternal Team.